So I'm going to, at some level, piggyback off of something that Mike said that I always think sort of rings true. Lawyers are actually the worst at it. I've noticed, maybe not the worst, but high there is like the planning tools that you use are important, but don't let it be an anxiety crutch to avoid implementation. So, I think you can sit there and spend a lot of time planning for every eventuality, but a lot of times that avoids actually taking the steps to implement something that is important. So lawyers are fantastic. I sit on our board here, so I see it at making very elaborate plans that are not designed to be implemented in any way. That's a rabbit hole that you need to avoid. That having been said, I think in my presentation I've got a couple of scenarios that I build into some spreadsheets that I give to clients that I always feel a little bit like maybe I'm perpetuating that as well, because sometimes when you start playing with those, you start dreaming in a way that is not productive. So what I want to talk about is cap tables, and there's kind of a dual purpose to cap tables that I think people need to focus on. Is it's a mechanism by which you can do some corporate housekeeping that is really important, and it's easy to overlook when you're building your business. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And it's also a planning tool, if you have it set up correctly, where you can do a little bit of planning, and it can be a real tool to decide, help you make decisions when you feel like you've got kind of an unlimited number of options that are available. So we'll just jump in. So at a very high level, what a cap table is it documents everybody's interests in your company. Okay? So what does that mean? It documents all the people who own equity in your company and all the people who have the ability to own equity in your company through some other mechanism. So when I say that, what that means is who are your current owners right now? Who has an option to purchase into your company? So do you have any employees that you've given options to? And then do you have convertible debt, safe notes, and other things that at some point will convert into equity in your company? And that's a piece that gets missed pretty frequently. You'll hear investors ask you about a fully diluted cap table. And what they're talking about is, I don't care just who's an owner today, who's going to be an owner 6 months from now, a year from now, who has rights in your business, and are they documented in some way? Now, that's important for investors to know so that they can gauge what they're investing in and the value of what they're investing in. But it also shows whether you've done a good job of keeping your records straight and doing your homework and understanding kind of people's rights and roles in your company. You'd be surprised at how many times we go through this exercise, and I do it pretty frequently with clients, and they, during the conversation, I learn about some right that they've given to somebody that I wasn't aware of, that they had never told me about, and things. And so this kind of, when you do this, it shows the ownership stake and it helps you understand what they are. Like I said, fully diluted means every right that people have in your company to ownership stake gets documented on that sheet. Some are easier than others. Okay, keep your cap table current at all times. Why that's important is, Mike talks about if you have a meeting with an investor and they say, hey, I want to have your financial model, or I want to have your financials, and an acceptable answer is not, I will get them to you in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or 5 days. These are the kind of things that you need to have on hand, ready to go. And it's kind of like the idea of that you're presenting yourself and your competence to your investors, and these are the kind of things that investors expect you to have and have handy. So it needs to be kept up to date at all times, and that also helps you be diligent about making sure that you haven't missed anything. And it helps you make good decisions quickly. I'm trying to, lawyers always have to be careful that you don't use too many examples that allow people to derive and understand who you're talking about. But, until you really look at the numbers, there's always a tension when I work with clients of, should I raise less money at a lower valuation, or should I hold out and raise more money at a higher valuation? What does that do to my ownership? And down the road, what does that, does that paint me into a corner somehow later? These can be good planning tools, and I'll show you in a second how that works, in order to kind of figure out where you're going, and make sure that you've left some room and some value. It helps you understand the dilutive impact of different, financings. Maybe you might make some different decisions about how much you want to raise based on how much that dilutes your ownership. You can understand, what's the impact of an option pool. An investor is going to look at, if you set up a certain size option pool, meaning these are the number of options I conceivably could issue to employees at some point, investors look at that as if you had already issued those all out. Because once they've agreed to a certain size option pool, they somewhat, most times have lost control of that. And so in their calculus, they'll say, those are all already issued. So, if you're a founder, you might say it might be really great to have an option pool representing 50% of the equity of the company. That's a terrible idea, because you get the drunken sailor argument of, sometimes if you have it, you use it. And the second part is that it has real dilutive effect that you need to conceive of. And like I said, it's going to be required during investor due diligence, and investors are going to expect you to have that information. Keep it organized and simple to understand. The more complicated, I think you've probably heard this already several times today, and you'll hear it more, is the more complicated you make things, the more difficult it is for an investor to understand, and the more that they're going to be turned off and worried that they don't understand something about your company. So, adding complexity for complexity's sake in all things that you do is not a benefit. You aren't going to look clever by doing that. All you're potentially doing is confusing investors, and confused investors, is one reason why they don't want to help finance your company. Make sure that your cap table's tailored to the corporate structure, and that it follows all the documents. This is more kind of good housekeeping issues that people, when they look at your business and they're looking at the way that you organize things, organize information, they're going to make assumptions about how you do the rest of your business based on how you can do these things. Okay. I did not write these slides. My mother did.
I did.
Okay.
I'm not kidding you. This is not a promotion to hire for Joe to get a job. If you don't have an attorney that's done M&A work before, and you show up and it's your Uncle Steve, that's a nice attorney, but he does consumer litigation, I'm done. I'm not signing documents that are probably useless. I have to know you have a good attorney. I was talking to one of my fellow investors about a deal the other night. This literally happened, and he said, "Have you read the documents yet?" And I said, "No, I haven't yet." He goes, "Who wrote them?" And I told him the name of the attorney. He goes, "I don't need to look at them. I already know how he writes the documents." You know how much time that saves? It's like credibility. Just make sure the attorney you hire has been down this road many times before. You don't want to pay to train an attorney about doing private equity placement, because SEC Rule 504 is not simple.
Yep.
It's a book.
The funny part about it, and I tell people this pretty frequently, is that for the most part, there's two ways that it goes. Attorneys who do this all the time actually will cost you less money in the long run. And if they don't, then whoever is doing it for you does not know what they're doing, right? So people who are competent attorneys, but who don't do this kind of work very much, they will charge you way more than somebody who does it all the time, because it's a hard area of law, and to Mike's point, you're training them to do it. If somebody comes in and says, "I can help you do a capital raise and it's going to be $500, it tells you that they also don't understand what they're doing. And both of those are problems. I'm going to skip, I don't remember, like Mike, I think that there's a way for me to get these spreadsheets on, but since everyone's got them in front of them, let's just talk about them. So I think that Mike is going to be sharing these in Excel. with everybody. There's no magic. I like Excel, and I am not a master, but I know how to use the $ and what it does and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm very proud of that. I Googled that. Anyway, so feel free to use them. Let me just talk you through kind of what it is and why I have it set up this way. So if you look in your sheet, I've got a series of tabs in this spreadsheet that Mike's going to give you access to. And I've set up somewhat simply with common shares, preferred shares, and options. And this is the way I lay out my cap tables. It's not magic. I'm sure there's lots of other ways to do it, but this is a way that kind of works for me and I use with clients. And so I'm walking you through a couple of scenarios. So the first spreadsheet that we're looking at shows two things. It shows 3 founders that happen to be my children's names. I was sitting at home doing that. And they have equal ownership in the company. You can play with this as much as you want, but for the most part, people, when they start off, they've got common shares in the company, and you've got a certain series of founders that you start from. And I've also established an option pool here, which is a fairly large option pool to start off, but it's one of those things that I didn't play with that. Some option pools kind of increase over time, but keep in mind that is how you document. You're going to want to have that on your cap table. More complex is, and I didn't include this here, but I can help you with that if you'd like, is if you have any kind of convertible debt, there's more work that you have to put into calculating what that means and how that impacts your cap table. But I think that's a little bit beyond our scope for today. So that's kind of the founders, right? Now the next tab that you look in there has a certain set of additional investors that I creatively called A, B, C, and D. You put their name and the number of shares that they've purchased in the company. You'll notice 2 things about this as you add them. I have a column here that says current equity undiluted. What does that mean? That means everybody who currently has an interest in the company, and it takes out any unissued options, right? So if we go and vote on something in the company as of today, I know that that's the voting percentage that people have to make decisions, okay? An investor, when they look at it, they want to know that, but more importantly, they're going to look at the next column that says current equity diluted, which is that fully diluted number that we talked about, which includes options. And if we do have any convertible debt, it would get a line in the cap table as well and would recalculate into those numbers. Okay. Next page, I've added a second set of investors that have made an additional investment in preferred shares. I'll talk through this at a little more level. There's 2 ways to do this. A lot of times I add a separate column, even if it's the same like preferred Class A, just so you can kind of keep track of who invested when. There'll be different valuations and things that you have. So on my cap tables, sometimes I'll add other columns, but since we have a limited size, I tried to keep it a little bit easier. So keep in mind, if you play with this, it's real easy to add another column and everything. Since I learned how to use those $signs, I think that it should continue to calculate. So anyway, but that's just, for example, just when you work through. So as you'll notice, as you add people in there, it both recalculates the current equity percentage, and then the fully diluted numbers calculates automatically, okay? Let's talk about the planning piece, which is a little bit, I guess it isn't on here. In the version that you're gonna get, I've got some columns under these in the Excel sheet that I have. And what I do with clients a lot of times is I've got different scenarios that they can look at the same time that says, if I raise $1 million at an $8 million valuation, what does that do to my equity percentage? And I usually lay them out sequentially, that there's highlighted in yellow is the numbers that you can change. And if you get this spreadsheet and you've got questions about it, just give me a call, I'll talk you through it. But it allows you, when you work through that cap table, it allows you to make some assumptions. That's the planning piece that we talked about is, maybe if I raise $300,000, I'd be willing to accept a $2 million pre-money valuation because it has this dilutive impact. Okay? And when I plan with clients and when we work with them, those are the decisions you make. How much money am I going to raise? And what's the valuation? The more money that you raise at a lower valuation, it eats through more of your founder's equity and it dilutes everybody more. So each of these columns or each of these tabs that are in this sheet will have the ability to play with those numbers. Like I said, I don't want you, because it becomes kind of a rabbit hole, I don't want you to sit there and plan for planning's sake, but it does sometimes help you to kind of look at it and make some good business decisions based on that spreadsheet. Okay? Any questions about that or what you would include? Okay, I'm going to talk about something that's not technically cap table, but as a lawyer and as part of your due diligence is incredibly important to me, is the next page. If you look on there, this is called a certificate register. Who here has a certificate register, even if you don't have certificates issued for your company? Okay, good. So what does that mean? This gives me very important pieces of information. I had a client one time who sent me, it was a disaster. It was one of those examples where it was somebody who was a smart lawyer who had never done one of these deals before. And I literally got to the point at the end where I threw my hands up and I said, I think we need to have a member meeting and vote that everyone agrees that this cap table is correct. Because there was a bunch of people who had invested. They changed kind of the way that they were calculating ownership. They started off with percentages and then that got complicated and nobody backed their way in. And it was literally, I had two tables that I had put together by looking at all of their documents over time. And I said, it's one or the other. And we had people that were off as much as 2 or 3%. But both of them, I think in my mind, I could argue for based on the documents that we had done. And it was a mess. It was absolutely a mess. And it was a mess because nobody kept track of, I think that they had done spreadsheets and they tried to keep a cap table, but nobody had actually done this. So at some point, somebody stepped in and instead of saying, you have 500,000 shares, it became like 750,000 shares because they were trying to make percentages work and whatever. Do not do that. What you need to do is you keep these, even if you're not going to issue certificates, keep your ownership this way. Tell me, okay, who's the owner? Keep them numbered sequentially. Tell me on what date you've issued these ownership interests. This is especially important if you have an LLC, because your accountant at the end of the year, I can't tell you how many calls I get this time of year with questions that are like, it's always like a Saturday morning and somebody you can tell is putting together their information for their accountant and they just want to be done with it. And it's like, Joe, when did we issue all of these, units to somebody? Because my accountant wants to know, like, when they became owners, how much, that they get as far as the allocations of profit and loss. So for LLCs, that's really important. And if you just track this information, you tell me, okay, I issued these on this date, this number of shares or units were issued, and then the next two columns is, was this ever canceled? Meaning, did we cancel a certificate either because it was broken up or was transferred to somebody else? And if we did, was it transferred to somebody? You'll notice I have a question mark. And who did you transfer it to? Okay? And so what that does is it allows you to track through who owns when, and you have a good record for people to show when they say, I look at your cap table and this doesn't make sense. Prove to me that Zoe owns 500,000 shares in your company. You can say, I issued it on this date for this amount, and here's the documentation. As you go, I always track these as common shares and then preferred shares. There's 2 different tabs in my cap table that does that. You can, some people will add, if they're worried about keeping their information, I have in the past added a column about how much people paid for their ownership, but if you have good documentation, you should be able to look at this and say, even if I can't find their subscription agreement, I know how much I raised money for at that point. But some people will add that. The preferred, you'll notice, is a little bit more complicated of a schedule. So I've got 2 different issuances here. You'll notice that I've got them dated. I like to close at the beginning of the month. I like to close in batches. So if you have investors that are coming in, it is more complicated and creates more of a headache if I have 3 people who come in this date, 4 people who come in this date. It's harder to keep track of. So if you're raising money, batch those together. That is critically important if you have an LLC, and it's critically important for if you have a convertible note offering, that you don't just sort of willy-nilly close those offerings. Because when you're doing a convertible note, has anyone ever done a convertible note in here? Okay, so Gary, you probably, hopefully we did that for you. But I close those. I close those in batches at the beginning of the month, because at some point somebody's going to have to figure out how much accrued interest you have. And if you have 30 people and they're invested all on different days, the spreadsheet becomes a nightmare to keep track of. Okay? So, but that's how I keep them. And like I said, I call it a certificate register. If we actually issue stock certificates to people, I can hand it to my assistant and she will create all of the certificates. But even if you don't do that, which a lot of companies don't, keeping it in this way is very logical and helps you. And especially if you get investors who come in and start asking during due diligence, this is a great way to keep it. So you should have an Excel spreadsheet. If you've got questions about using it, let me know. But this is definitely a way to keep it.
Joe probably is not going to say this, but from an entrepreneur perspective, I would always rely heavily on my attorneys to keep the cap table, to be the keeper. And when things change, we would say, hey, we need to change this. Please send us the updated version. Because they always had the record of like, who's the record keeper? Well, if you know it's an external source, and it doesn't cost a lot to have it done, but it costs a lot to have it fixed and after the fact, knowing that you're not messing up or you're not messing up a percentage, and then all of a sudden you're making these representations potentially in a closing that are incorrect. It's just really not worth a few $100s occasionally that you would pay an attorney to do it right. That's kind of my advice. If you can do this, you can fill it in Excel, but you can also mess it up really, really easily. So why not look to the professionals to manage it for you?
You're exact. I can tell you, I've done this. I've recreated them several times, and every time I recreate a cap table, it takes 3 to 4 times as long as it would have taken me just over time to update it. It just does. It takes a lot more work, and I can tell you, it's easier to see that you're missing documentation as you go than it is to go back and recreate it.
I think the other thing is often in diligence, you'll have to certify that it's correct, or what's the right terminology?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the attorneys are going to have to say they certify that it's correct, and therefore, if your attorneys have been managing it, it's easy for them to say, I know this matches all the documents, versus paying them to do that work after them.
Because they audit it. I mean, they have to.
It gets audited.
Yeah.
Or it should in a good closing.
Questions about that? All right. I even got it done a little bit early, but like I said, much to the same as Mike. If you've got questions about it, shoot me an email, give me a call. I'd be happy to walk you through. But I do think it's helpful.
Joe, since we have a little bit of time, can you talk about when you're early on in a company and you're giving shares, how to value that with stock options, and when you get to the point of more sophistication, like needing the 409A, and because a lot of I think the group in this audience are very, very early on, and there's tax consequences in how you give stock options. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So that could honestly be its own its own class, because the tax impacts of how you deal with equity is misunderstood by people who don't do it a whole lot. And I'm no tax lawyer, but I have to deal with it enough that I know kind of how it goes. There's a couple things that I think you need to keep in mind is early on, if you give somebody equity in a company, right, it at some level has value. Now that may be a very minimal value, especially if you give it up front, but it has value. Most people, when they're trying to figure out how to value equity in a company as from an employee's perspective, right? There's a tension between I want this to be worth nothing or close to nothing for IRS tax purposes because it's compensation. But at some point, you're selling blue sky to your employees of saying, you're willing to take $20,000 less in income because this is going to be worth something at some point, right? And that's a conversation that's really hard to have because there's a lot of assumptions that go into that really your employees have to buy into. So when I work with clients to do that, we talk about, okay, well, where are we today? Where do we think we're going to be 3 years from now as far as a value of the company if this goes really well? And then I use that to back into if I'm going to give an employee, a stock option that I think is going to increase in value, $5 an option over that time, I'll take the $20,000 that I was going to pay them, divide it by the 5. If I'm a good negotiator, if I'm not, then I put some, there's some back and forth there that you have. But there's no math formula that actually makes that work, right? I mean, there's assumptions that you put on that. But that's how you value it. It's like anything else when you're selling an investor. I have a backstory. You have to have some assumptions that make some sense. But it's not a math formula that I think will get solved. So that's what I do. Excuse me. I try to decide what do we think this is going to be worth in a few years. What is the chance that we get there? And try to put that in the value. Now let's talk about the tax side of that. The tax side is if I have an employee, the most tax efficient way to do that is I give them all of the equity up front and I vest it over time. Okay? The reason that I do that is if the company is worth very little up front, then my employee can report that as income when it's not worth anything, or very close to nothing, and then pay the tax at that point, and then they don't pay the tax when it vests. It's a very simplified version, and there's a lot of other things that go into it, but that's a basic idea. As an employee, if you are a later stage company and you issue them and it's very clearly worth something, like you've raised money, you have a valuation that's set, that kind of thing. When you vest that equity over time, your employee might look at that a little bit differently. So I would say if you're early on, it's hard to make a big mistake with this. If you're further down the road, then you need to get tax and legal advisors to help you do that because it's hard to unwind and there's real tax impact. Cool.
How does IRS know what is the company valued for?
They don't, but they will. They have the ability to audit, and if they do audit, then they're going to ask you to justify how you valued, the company. So, for example, the most difficult situation that I get into with clients is I'm raising money for preferred shares in a company. So, the preferred shares have certain rights. They've got distribution rights. They get paid first if the company sells, all that kind of stuff. And then I also have common ownership, which is what most of the founders get. How do I justify, if I'm selling preferred shares for $10, how do I justify a $2 per share common valuation, right? The IRS is the rules are pretty founder friendly in the sense that they look at a liquidation type analysis. 409A, like Sharice referred to a 409A analysis, which is avoids deferred compensation penalties. And those are very, there's a method to doing it, but it's basically a set of assumptions that you get to. And so the answer to your question is, there's no way to 100% assure that you're never going to have problems with the IRS if you set those numbers. But a lot of people who get into trouble, it's because they just issue it, they say it's a penny without any backing or any assumption or any knowledge about why they set that. And the IRS comes in and says, prove to me why that was the value. They don't have anything to support it, and that's when you get into trouble, in my opinion. So, does that answer your question?
Again, not to make this overly complicated, but I think it's an area, I raised the question to show the complication around it. If you're giving employees stock options, it's good to get an attorney involved because there's a lot of complexity. The attorney and tax advisors involved. It's not just something to be like, oh, here's a 2-page document memo saying you get 1% of the company. That doesn't quite suffice.
It doesn't, and the problem that I actually have run into more and more is that people who do this before they get any attorney involved, they give them a whole bunch of equity and then there's no strings to it, right? And so then all of a sudden you've got a founder who is like all in it at the beginning, and then they, got married, got a better job, moved to some other state, whatever, and all of a sudden they're not involved anymore. And you've given them a huge piece of equity in the company, and you as the founder who's still around is sitting there slaving away, working hard every day, and you've got the same interest in the company as this person who walked out the door. And that's a mistake that I see made when everyone is kind of in the we love each other phase, and there's no thought pattern to what happens if we break up? What happens if somebody leaves? What happens if somebody isn't pulling their weight? And investors are kind of nice in that way because they show up, and I've had this happen a lot of times. People don't have that agreement. And the investor shows up and says, that's great, you guys are all in it for 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If I'm going to put money in, all of you are vesting over 3 years or 4 years or whatever. And so that happens pretty frequently, and it's not a bad thing. But it's good to get that planned out up front, especially when you're the founder and you're trying to, somebody walks out the door and leaves you doing 2 jobs. It'd be nice that you get some compensation for that.
And the worst part is when you are in a company and 2 years later, you end up having to buy out that partner.
Oh, yeah.
Because the partner has the shares and they're not involved anymore, but they have the shares.
Yeah.
And you have to go back and buy them back. And nothing hurts more than buying back your own shares.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep, thank you.
All right.